As Edie mentioned, I'm an organic farmer. I haven't been a farmer that long, although I grew up on a farm in Sussex. But I was away from farming a long time, but I was always a gardener and became an organic gardener, I guess, somewhere along the line, probably 20 years ago or more. And generally had gardens up to half an acre, depending where I was living and how much land I had access to and how much food I thought I should grow, which was always too much. But so I've had a lot of gardening experience, and I think that's probably, I'll try and keep it applicable to you on a farm scale. It's a little bit different, but we're doing much the same thing. So, so the first thing about soil is a lot more than just dirt. You know, there's definitely a physical aspect to soil that's mineral based. So there's gravel, sand, silt, clay, and those are the four sort of basic soil physical particle sizes, but they're all generally the same. Depending on where you are, they're all the same mineral compound. A lot of it's silica, but there's a lot of other compounds. Now I took a little bit of my soil here. If you don't know what kind of soil you have, take a handful, or I probably should have put a little bit more in here, about a third of the way full, and then with some water, and then really shake it. And then by the end of my talk, it's like a sand big timer, basically. When this is all settled out, I'll be done. But as time elapses, the first things will settle down to the bigger particles, like gravel, obviously, and that's already at the bottom now, probably. And then sand will settle, and then silt, and then clay. And if you have a loam, which is a combination of all three of those, you'll actually be able to see different layers. Now, my soil is mostly clay. It's a clay loam. So there's probably a little bit of sand. I can see a dark line showing up there now. And there's not too much silt. There's mostly clay. And so that'll take quite a while to settle out. And in fact, it may not settle out completely by the time I'm done. So I'll put it there and try not to shake it up too much. But it's a good way to tell what you're working with, the basic attributes of the soil that you're working with, the physical attributes. So if you're working with a sandy soil, you're going to have really good drainage, but you're going to have to water a lot more. And so if the soil profile, the water in the soil profile, if you water a plant on sandy soil, the water will make a little spike. If you cut it, if you made a window in the soil, there'd be a direct spike. The water would run right down this little cone. But if you, in a clay soil, which tends to hold on to the water, it'll spread out more and it'll kind of hold on to that water. But now my parents, they have a very sandy soil where they are, and so my dad's constantly watering if it's dry weather. But we have a kind of a clay loam, and we've had a lot of organic matter, and so we're usually pretty well off. We don't start irrigating until it gets pretty dry. So that can make a difference for things like irrigation. And the problem with clay is that it have very poor drainage. And so you have this sticky soil it's really wet and sticky when it's wet, when it's rainy, and then it'll dry up and be brick hard. Especially, so you want to stay away from working those soils when they're too wet. So, especially important for us where we're using tractors. So we'll not go on our fields when it's wet at all, or else we'll end up with these big clods that we can't get rid of for the whole season. So that's just sort of but the big difference between just the sort of physical dirt and soil is the living organisms in the soil and the dead organisms in the soil and dead plant material. So soil is very much, most people don't think of it, but it's like an animal, sort of a conglomerate animal. It has to breathe, it has to have water, and if it does that, it's very much alive. A handful of soil, I brought a little bit of soil from my greenhouse because it's some places thawed out really now. But a couple of this will have probably over 1 million organisms in it, microorganisms. It's got bacteria, protozoans, nematodes, all kinds of stuff in there. And so that's in between the little particles of soil are little pools of water, and that's where the organisms live. They live next to those, and so maybe I'll just pass this around. And you can look at the soil. This is the soil that was pretty heavy clay a few years ago. It wasn't a really bad soil, but we've been adding quite a bit of organic matter into it from our compost, and it's getting a nice crumb structure now, and so it's the air can get in through the soil and the water can infiltrate, but it doesn't get, it can go right down through. The soil holds what it needs and then the rest goes through. And how does it smell? Yeah? It's, sorry, I should have brought out a different container, but that was the only thing I could find with the bags. But, so those are some of the physical attributes of the soil. Now, if you have questions anytime, just put your hand up and ask questions. I'm more used to a sort of a seminar style, so if you have questions at any point, you don't have to wait for your questions. So that soil is, it's now quite good for growing in. It's not as far along as I would like it to be. It takes a while to build a healthy soil. So it's, now we find in that soil now we find lots of worms. That's one of the things I wanted to mention too is earthworms and the role they play. Some of the actual crumbs in that bag of soil they're actually like worms manufacturers, they're castings and that kind of thing, but there's the microorganisms create different organic materials that sort of bond those particles together, the fine clay particles in the little nodule crumbs. And so that's what we're looking for in a really good soil. How many of you use a tiller in your garden? Yeah. You want to use a tiller very judiciously because it's really hard on that crumb structure. And so what it does, it physically beats those apart, especially if it's dry or wet. So you want to really be careful with a tiller and use it as little as possible. We're actually moving on the farm, we're moving to a sort of minimum tillage, and we've retired our tiller now completely. We didn't use it much anyway in the last 4 years since we started farming. I tried using it a bit in the first year, and I really wasn't happy with it, what it did to the soil. And
what do you do now to break it up?
We use what's called a chisel plow, but what I normally do in a garden, like in our greenhouse too, even when we can't get in there with a tractor, we use just a fork. We use a manure fork, or if there's rocks and it's still too hard, we use a heavier digging fork. Some people use a broad fork. Yeah. It's kind of a hard, depends on how big your garden is, and yeah, it's huge, yeah. So you're kind of at a scale where you're not tractor scale and you're not, yeah. But I know people that grow a couple of acres and don't use a tractor and use a tiller very minimally. So you just want to be kind of judicious about how you use it. Because every time you go through, it tends to, and the other thing it does is oxidize. It brings up organic matter, and that organic matter oxidizes. Now, the organic matter in a soil, a good soil, is between, it's above 2% generally. So sandy soils, it's really hard to get the organic matter up very high. And our soils are between 2 and 8%, which is 8% is really on the high end of things. So unless you're in a soil, sometimes you'll get a muck soil, which is all organic matter, and that's generally where a peat bog or something like that, or a bin or something, some place where organic matter is usually quite a swampy spot too. So organic matter is really important because it's basically the food for all those microorganisms. And it also it helps with the aeration. When you look at this soil, there's actually little bits of roots in there, and there's little bits of plant material that we've added, little bits of compost. I won't jump ahead to compost yet, but it's really your key method of improving your soils is compost, but particularly for certain problems. So so the organic matter, you want to be able to preserve that as much as you can. And I actually saw some pictures of the garden here, and it was really nicely mulched, and that was that's really the best way to grow things as you can. The only problem with mulches is that if you have your soil covered up with mulches all the time, it's really slow to warm up in the spring. So you kind of want to pull it back, let your soil warm up, and then plant, and then you can start putting new mulch down and that kind of thing. So we've been experimenting a little bit with some of our compost, putting a thin layer of compost on the garden in the fall, and not before freeze up, because you're not supposed to spread it after it freezes up, because you lose nutrients, they wash away. But so we've been experimenting with different things, and that potato farmers and PEI in places, they're experimenting with spreading hay on their fields too, just a thin layer of hay, and that protects the soil, because the biggest enemy besides physical wear and tear from tillers and that kind of thing is rain. Just being exposed, the soil being exposed to the weather. The rain droplets tend to break up those little crumbs, and it especially with a clay soil like ours, it'll make a crust. They'll break down and they'll kind of make a layer that's a crust that the air has a hard time getting through, and seedlings, if you plant carrots are the hardest. They have a hard time getting through that little bit of clay crust. So we try and put a lot of compost right in the row where our carrots are, and that kind of helps that crust from happening too. Some people I know lay little strips of carpet down right on top of their carrots when they seed them, and because carrots are also very susceptible to, you don't have to use carpet, but they're very susceptible to drying out because they're planted very shallow, and so they dry out. Once they dry out, they're done. They're toast. Once the roots dry out, that little cotyledon that emerges out of the seed, they die. So you would just want to keep the moisture there, but you also don't want that crust forming. So sometimes even watering with a watering can will help form that crust. So you can keep the moisture in, all the better. If you can keep the moisture from people from breaking it up. So worms, I have a picture on my computer, maybe I'll show it to you afterwards, but worms play an important role. Earthworms, we have two species that are really important. Everybody's seen the big earthworms, and everybody's seen the little garden worms. There's actually two species. There's several species of worms here, but they play a major role in taking organic matter from the surface, especially the night crawlers. They'll actually come up, and you'll see them actually grab a leaf, and they'll pull it down into their hole. And so they'll take that organic matter down there, they'll eat it, and then it'll pass through their system, and it becomes basically fertilizer for your plants. If you're a damp day when it's kind of drizzly, is the best time to watch that. But I used to use some leaves in my garden for mulch, and at one time I actually could see 4 or 5 night crawlers coming up, and they were all trying to grab leaves and take them down their holes. So I didn't actually know that they would do that, but they do. But they play a really important role in mixing things up, and there's even a theory that we wouldn't have agriculture if it wasn't for earthworms, because in the tropics they don't really have that the earthworm population. They have ants and termites, but it's really earthworms that have been they're really the real major movers in creating soil. So plants, earthworms together kind of makes the plants provide the food, the earthworms mix it up, and so, but you can put different layers. You can put a layer of rock, like sort of gravelly stuff, a layer of sand, and a layer of compost in a little window box with some worms, and they'll completely mix that up. The whole thing will turn kind of black, brown, instead of being different colored layers. It'll give them enough time, and not like less than a year, they'll completely mix that up. So it's amazing what they do. So they're your best friend, and that's the tiller also. It's really hard on those guys too. Sorry, I forgot my next point here. Okay, yeah, so organic matter, as I said, oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention too is pH. The soils in New Brunswick tend to be naturally a little bit acidic, and there's two ways you can correct that. The most common way, and that just acidic, it just means it's the pH, when the pH is below 7, it means it's acidic. And the simplest way to fix that is to, and you can check that with basically litmus paper, which is a paper you dip it in a solution. You basically do what I did here, and then you would put the litmus paper in that, and it would turn a different color depending on what the pH was. If you really want to know what your soil, more about your soil, you can get a soil sample. You can take a soil sample to the Department of Agriculture. It costs $60 though to get it done, so it's quite expensive, but they'll tell you the pH. They might actually do a pH test individually, and that just it would cost you a lot less. But I don't know for sure. But anyway, the most common way to correct pH problems, a low pH problem, is with limestone, ground limestone. This is kind of a pink color because it's from Havelock, lime deposit in Havelock, which has a little iron in it. So sometimes it's white, sometimes it's kind of pink like this, and sometimes it's gray. The Brookville lime and St. John. The gray stuff from Brookville has a little bit of magnesium in it too, which is sometimes nice to, sometimes your soil, you want to keep, there's a sort of ratio between calcium and magnesium, and I prefer the dolomitic limestone a little bit because it's that magnesium, you want to keep that in balance. So there's, the soil's it's not a really, you know, there's soil science, but creating a good soil and maintaining it's a bit of an art, and it's because it's really complex, especially a living soil like this. Sometimes it's reduced down to, you know, the sort of conventional science around soils is very chemical based. It's not very biological oriented.
How much lime would you use?
Depends on your pH and your soil a little bit.
And if you don't know it?
Hmm?
And if you do not know it?
If you do not know it, you can look for certain weeds will indicate a pH, like sorrel. If you have sorrel in your garden, it's so if you just look up weeds that indicate low pH or acid soil, and if you have those weeds in your garden, like I can usually pick out in my strawberry patch where the acid spots are by the weeds that grow, and so. And there's actually a lot of deficiencies in your soil that are indicated by different weeds. So that's one thing that you can do. And so I would add probably 2 or 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet. That you're never going to hurt anything with that amount. And but there are different rates. So yeah, I think you can put up to 15 pounds per. I'm used to thinking in how many tons per acre, so we would put up to 15 tons per acre, but 10 to 15 pounds per.
Is the pelletized lime useful or not?
It's faster acting, and I'm not sure, we can't use that as organic growers, we can't use that because it's, I would be a little careful with it because it can actually, in a sense, burn the worms and animals like that. The best thing is just plain old ground limestone, and you know, farmers say that's how it sweetens your soil. Basically, it just sweetens up your soil. And you know, they used to actually taste your soil. It tasted sour. You could try this, but that's one way to tell if it's acid, if it tastes sour. But it's not highly recommended, by the way. But so a little bit of lime is a good way to increase the pH in your soil.
Where's a good place to get that? Where's a good place to get?
Oh, you can get it at Feeds and Needs, Co-op. Just ask for agricultural lime, and
I mean,
yeah,
here
it comes in.
with the garden, we have these little plots. We just need a handful.
Yeah, a couple handfuls. I mean, some people will use wood ashes too. Wood ashes, if you have a friend that has wood ashes. Now, wood ashes, I wouldn't use too much of them, but because they're basically, it's quite alkaline wood ashes. That's actually what they used to use to make lye, which is very caustic. So I just sprinkled a little bit around, and the best thing to do is actually put it in your compost and then put it on the, but yeah, I mean, it's really cheap too. It's like $4 a bag, so yeah.
I just want to mention that for the gardens that are here, when we first set them up, we had the soil testing done. It was very high clay, but because the volunteers came in and they did the double digging system all the way around, so actually by working all the compost in and deep, we kick-started this garden, so we were about 3 years ahead of ourselves by doing that double digging. So the pH was good in the garden. We didn't have to add any lime at all, but the compost material was low because we had a high clay. We needed a lot more.
You're kind of
material.
up on a hilltop here. The soils tend to be very heavy clay around here with quite a few rocks.
So I would say, if anything in this garden, you probably would want to continue to work your organic compost in to keep that.
And if the pH was okay, then you don't really need a lot of lime.
The pH was good, and we didn't have to add any lime at all in the garden. So.
And one of the things that this is a compost that I make, and I had it tested in the pH is 7.4, so it's a little bit on the alkaline side. So if you have a really good compost, even if the materials you start with are acid, the pH will increase in the composting process. So I can add this. I can avoid putting lime on by adding this a little bit. When I get worried about lime is when I think I'm deficient in calcium. So, and that can. It's some crops. It's really calcium is important for, like our strawberries. It's quite important for. There's quite a bit of calcium used in fruit production, and so I don't know. Strawberries must be high in calcium.
Do you have a strawberry pick out there or no?
Occasionally, yeah. We try and pick everything, but then sometimes we have extra, and our CSA customers will offer to them first, and sometimes plants. And so we don't have a huge planting of strawberries, but yeah. So one of the important things is I don't try to feed the plants as in sort of conventional agriculture that uses chemicals. They get a soil test, they look at, okay, what are the levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium? Those are the big three they look at. And, okay, they look at how much the crop is going to take, and they add just enough to, hopefully, to grow a crop, and for that season. And then basically they're starting from whatever's left over next year again. So, but in organic gardening, and I guess most gardeners, the best thing to do is to try and feed the soil. So you're trying to feed the organisms that are in the soil. So you're trying and give them as much food as they can handle. You probably can put too much compost on at once, but it'd be pretty rare to have enough compost to do that. So you want to basically feed those organisms because they will feed your plants. That's what you're really trying to do. So they'll provide the organisms or the nutrients for your plants by breaking down the compost that you put on there and the materials that you put in the soil, the minerals that are there. Often there's huge reserves of nutrients in the soil, but it's not available to the plants until microorganisms make it available. So worms chewing up soil as he's chewing up little bits of stuff in the soil, but that worm is excreting all kinds of nutrients and minerals that are in a form that's available to the plants. So if you just I don't worry too much about this season's, what this crop needs for this season, because I've tried to add enough material, and I'll add some compost this year, but it's not really to address any fertility problems. It's just to sort of maintain my soil over time. And so I try and maintain that. And the other way of doing that besides compost, if you have enough room And if you can work it into, it's sort of an art, but if you can work cover crops into your gardening, it's a really great way to increase the fertility, increase the friability of your soil, that crumb structure, and sort of lock up nutrients too. If you can tie up those nutrients, because a lot of nutrients are soluble, and so we have a lot of rain here, and those nutrients will tend to, especially nitrogen, will tend to wash out of the soil, and so you'll lose them basically, and they become a pollutant somewhere downstream. So for instance, when we take out early potatoes, we'll plant oats and peas. And I try not to leave that soil bare for very long, and that's growing, the oats and peas are growing my fertility for next year. And oats are really cheap. There's buckwheat is another one that's easy to put in your rotation. So you can, as soon as you harvest something, if you're not planting, now, in a small garden, you tend to replant something else, but something else that you're going to harvest. But if you have a spot and you have extra room, and even between the rows or even in around the plants, if you do it at the right time, you can plant different crops. So there's a really wide range of things you can use as cover crops. There's buckwheat, clovers. Some people use dwarf white clover. It's a little bit hard to fight back. Once you plant that, you got to fight. It'll take over your garden. But winter rye is one, but it's a bit problematic. You can plant it right up until September 15th. It's the latest day for planting winter rye, winter's over, and it'll keep the soil protected over the winter, but it starts growing as soon as the snow's gone. Which is a good thing, but it's a little bit hard to deal with if you're not, even on the farm we have a hard time, because by June it'll be this tall. So it's, you have to beat it back, sort of, in a sense, and it's a little bit hard to kill. But it's a great crop if you have a little bit of room. Maybe if you're expanding your garden. If you're expanding your garden this year and you want to plant something late summer, fall, it's a good way to protect the soil, and you can let it grow the next year, and it'll actually produce rye grain, but you can make rye bread with it, once you cut it, once it starts to head out, you can cut it and it'll kill it. And then you can use the straw for mulching and things like that. So we actually use sometimes for mulching our strawberries. We're growing straw for our strawberries. And that's the other thing with oats, grain, any grain, basically, you can let it grow, but you don't have to let it go beyond what they call the pollen stage. And you can cut it, and it makes great mulch. It's sort of between hay and grain, like straw mulch from grain, which is really mature. It's got a little bit of green in it. It's not, so it's got a little bit of nitrogen still in it, but straw tends to be just mostly carbon, which is great for your soil, but you want it on top of the soil. And so if you can work cover crops in, that's a really good way to improve your fertility. An organic farmer ideally has almost half their fields in cover crops. We do a little bit less because we have a really large compost supply. But if we weren't doing that, we'd be doing a lot more cover cropping. And so you can kind of get away with it if you have a lot of compost. But we still do some. We do winter rye, oats and peas. The oats and peas mix they're field peas, and they add nitrogen into the soil. So you can also use other crops like vetch, hairy vetch, clovers. We use another crop. It's called tickling bench, and it adds a lot of nitrogen into the soil. And things that are heavy feeders like tomatoes, potatoes, they like those crops in that year before. If you can put clover or something in the year before, then they'll do really well. And you might not think it would make that much difference, but I've seen in a field where I planted oats the year before, partway over, and then I had some other crop in there. I forgot what I had, potatoes. the next year I planted corn there, which I normally wouldn't, it's sort of an overlap thing. I normally wouldn't plant corn after potatoes because it's too heavy feeders, but I could see a significant difference in that corn where the oats were and where the potatoes were. So it was far ahead, the plants were taller, and I had a lot more ears off those. So if those are kind of things you can do to improve your soil and sort of maintain your soil, I guess. Any questions about cover crops or anything like that? Has anybody used anything like that? Or no?
How about using grass clippings? That's what I did for many years.
Yeah, you can use them for mulch. Yeah,
Mulch.
yeah. But
During the summer, I did that.
Mm-hmm.
I used dried grass clippings.
Yeah.
That's okay too.
Yeah, they're really high in nitrogen. You don't want them too thick; they kind of mat together and get kind of stinky and slimy.
Not when they are completely dry.
Yeah, but if you can use mulches like that, they protect the soil, and you'll see where the worms are coming up to get that stuff. You'll see, you pull it back, you can see all kinds of little wormholes and crumbs, and you'll usually see worms too. If it's not too dry, you'll see worms.
You mentioned something about a cover. A mulch that should be put down late in the fall before the winter? After the frost or before the frost? You said something.
You usually don't do anything after it's too cold. Yeah,
before the frost.
Yeah. I sometimes put compost down in the fall, but just to protect the soil. I'm doing more and more of it now because I don't like to see that soil bare. If I can't get a cover crop in, or there's not enough crop residue there to protect the crop, then.
Do you cut your grass off and then leave the roots in, or do you chisel it the next spring?
If we plant oats or something like that, yeah, I usually we just harrow it in, basically.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you
we
just
don't.
lightly prepare the soil. In
Yeah.
the greenhouse, do you cut your plants and leave the roots in?
No, we usually pull them out. Yeah, depending on. I mean, sometimes if it's a root crop, it's obviously going to come out. But something like tomatoes, we generally pull them out, or we cut them off, and I actually get in there with the tractor sometimes, and I can wiggle in around with the harrow, and then that sort of breaks them up. And, yeah.
Is there any roots that you leave in the soil when you're?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's actually cover crops that you grow just to leave in the soil, like root crops. Like there's sometimes we just don't get stuff. There's a few things that don't get harvested, but we don't pull stuff out like corn or anything like that. We just leave the stubble there. We don't even mow it down. We probably should, but there are cover crops.
So then these roots, they will disintegrate over the winter?
Oh yeah. In fact, in the spring there'll just usually be a hole in the soil. Maybe a little bit of residue around. Like there's daikon radish, like they're type. Mangles or another one that is they've been used for a long time in Europe they use for livestock feed too, but they go way down into the soil, and they basically aerate the soil and make a big hole, and that'll sort of the organic matter will go down in there. And there's one now, it's called tillage radish. It has a root like this long, and it's like and some things that are good if you have a garden that's not, if you're taking over a new garden, it's kind of compacted and it's not very good soil, and if you can afford to, grow sweet clover is a really great one because it has roots that are 5 or 6 feet deep. It'll go right down and loosen all that up. It'll loosen up compaction, and it will. Also add nitrogen, and it adds a lot of organic matter. It grows about 5 or 6 feet down and 5 or 6 feet up. You've probably seen it a lot going alongside beside the road. It looks like alfalfa. The leaves look like alfalfa, but it has little white flowers on it. And yeah.
Once you plant something like that that's going down 6 feet, is it easy to just cut it back and then plant something else there, or do you have to leave it?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like the winter rye is the toughest one, and so I would stay away from that if you're, if you hit it at the right time, it's not too hard to kill, but it's fairly big then. So now some people, what they do is actually there's a Rodale Institute in in Pennsylvania, they're growing winter rye, and they built a crimper that crimps it at a certain stage. They just knock it all down, and it breaks the stems, and that kills it. And then they go along and they actually just transplant tomatoes and things into it. So it's a mulch already down. Yeah. So that's really neat. I'd like to try some of that too. It's, so there's people growing things like rye, but it can really get away from you and take over your garden. Like honestly, it's over my head. It's great for growing straw because it has such long straw, a lot of volume. But so yeah, there's cover crops like tillage radish. With the seeds fairly expensive. Trying to mangles, the seed's not so expensive, but some of them are monsters, are like 2 feet long. But and I think they're good to eat. They're sort of like a turnip, but usually fed to livestock. Even kale. Kale is one that you wouldn't think would be a good cover crop, but it's something you can plant in the fall. And there are forage kales that, like we would try and plant them for our pigs. And so the pigs would go out and have food until, you know, I've gone out at New Year's and harvested my kale out of the snow with no protection. So, you know, the pigs will root through the snow and you know, if they're around late in the year, then they have a food source. But it also, the only thing you have to be careful with your cover crops is growing something like a kale or oilseed radish is another one. Those you want to keep moving your crops around in the same family. The crops are in the same family, so anything in the brassica family can be you have to count it as a crop in your rotation. So we try and move things around so we never have the crop in the same place for about 5 years. So or the same type of crops. So all the brassicas like cabbage, kale, turnips, those kind of things, we try not to grow them in the same place. So if we grow oilseed radish, we have to not grow things there because what happens is disease can build up or pests. So I know that with a small plot, you can't really worry too much about that. But it's important to keep in mind that you don't grow your tomatoes in the same spot every year. It's tempting sometimes when you find a spot, like we have a spot where onions just do fantastic. But I'm kind of like 2 years is enough. I know I'm asking for trouble if I plant them there again next year. So I might be all right, but I might have disease problems building up. So okay, compost. I've been making compost for quite a long time. Just before, any more questions about soil before we move into compost?
I wanted to ask you one more question. Do you
Yep.
use crops like the radish crops if you get like the pure eagle or something in your soil? Or do you just rotate it away and then come back to that later?
Generally try rotation. Some people will do, there's a certain type of radish. I'm trying to think of what type it is now. They'll plow it in and it creates actually when you plow it into the ground, it creates a toxin that will kill but it's only for specific pests, nematodes generally. So generally if you have a healthy soil, you don't have many pest problems anyway. It's only when you get into big sort of monocrop. I mean everybody, if you've tried to grow potatoes, you have potato beetles, and cucumber beetles are the bane of everybody's existence. But we only have 3 crops generally on our 3 pests in our gardens, and I think it's because we have a really wide range of crops. We move them around. We have hedgerows and forest around us, so there's all kinds of beneficial insects that tend to attack some of the pests. So potato beetles are the only ones that really cause us economic loss. Cucumber beetles, we just put row cover over the whole. All of our cucurbits, all of our squash, all of our cucumbers, all of our melons, and we actually get quite a benefit from that in terms of heat too. So like it warms the plants get quite a head start under the row cover. I don't know if many of you have seen row cover, what it looks like. It's kind of a white spun. It's kind of a fibrous hot product. It's a light cloth. It's white. and it probably blocks a little bit of light, but it's only like 10% or something, but it traps the heat in there, and it also keeps insects. And so it adds a little bit of frost protection too, so. But anyway, the key to pest management is generally good soil. So if you have a healthy soil, you have healthy plants, you generally won't have tremendous pest problems. You will have pest problems, but for us, they're not huge economic losses. The only one we have to deal with is potato beetles. That's the one we haven't figured out a way to. We're working on it, but so we tried picking them, but now we use actually an organically approved pesticide. That's the only thing we ever use, and we wouldn't grow potatoes if it wasn't for that. And it's a biological pesticide. So, but the other pest.
What's the name of this pesticide? What is the name?
It's called Entrust, but you can't buy it unless you have an pesticide applicator license. And actually, well, they might sell it in Maine under a different name in smaller quantities, but
is it available for the home gardener in small?
It's not really available, no.
As a spray or so?
Yeah, it's really like it takes 16 grams per acre, so it's like really.
Very little.
Yeah, but it's expensive too. It's $600 a pound or something. So, yeah. So compost. This is a sample of compost that I've been making the last year and a half now. It's from heavy, but passed around. It's mostly horse manure and bedding from the harness racing track here in town. And it's been through a process, what's called a thermophilic process. So the piles, we make these big piles, long windrows.
Where do you get the horse manure? Where do you get the horse manure?
We have a contract to haul it away from the harness racing track here in town, but if you find somebody that has a horse or two, there's lots of people are calling me all the time to take their horse manure, and I'm like, no, I got enough, sorry. I don't have time to haul anymore. But there's lots of stables around. I know right now there's a guy who's calling me, wanted me to, it's like 10 years worth of horse manure from 10 horses or something. It's a huge pile. It's almost enough to probably fill this place about this deep. So.
Where does he live?
Out on the Handwell, actually, but he wants to get rid of the whole thing. So. But anyway, that's just what we're using now. You can use a lot of materials for making compost. And basically my motto is get whatever you can, as much material as you can in terms of making compost. So leaves, grass clippings, if you know they're from someplace that doesn't use pesticide, your kitchen waste, of course, but there's all kinds of sources, so you kind of have to be willing to take a lot of materials to make nice compost. Brush and stuff like that, it takes a long time to break down, but if you can get the little branches off of trees, like the very fine, that's, it'll break down in your compost. It might take a little bit longer, but that's really good for the soil. So that's...
What about wood chips? I know they take a long time to break down.
Yeah, and that's the challenge with this is that's been through a 1/4-inch screen to take out wood chips. And so we'll take those and dry them and use them for animal bedding. So we try and keep them out of the garden. But this has still got quite a bit of wood in it. It's just smaller stuff, and it's got a lot of straw. It's quite fibrous. I have an older compost here that's more fine. But what we do to avoid problems, the reason most people have problems is that it hasn't been composted. The wood chips haven't been composted through a sort of a long. This is over a year old, so a lot of people will put it on and dig it right in, or farmers will put it on, spread it on the field, and then they'll plow it in. And what that does, it puts it way down in the soil where there's not much air, and it sort of robs all the nitrogen from the soil and your plants. Because the bacteria that break down wood need nitrogen. And so that's the key to making nice compost too, is to get a
You
mix
know,
of carbon and nitrogen.
I once got this manure from Coburn, I guess they're great.
Yeah, yeah,
And normally I put it on top. When I planted my flower pots, I put it on top, and then it was fine because it waters down and puts the nutrients in. And 1 year I dug it into the soil, and nothing wanted to grow. The flowers were about 6
Yeah.
weeks later before they started growing again.
yeah. So
Because the roots
that's
were-
always the biggest problem that people have with woody material in compost. If you
And
have-
because that compost is not enough composted. So when you get it, you can only put it on top, or you have to put it in
Yeah.
a separate compost pile and compost for another year.
Yeah. There's sort of two ways to make compost. One is the hot method, the thermophilic method. That thermophilic means it's just there's bacteria that love heat in there. And they're basically the only thing that can live at the heat. Now, our compost piles get up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 55, I think, Celsius. No, it's higher than that. It's quite hot. Like, you can't keep your hand in the compost because we have such a large volume, and we have to compost. We can't even call it compost as an organic grower until it's been through that process where it's been heated for a minimum of 3 weeks. And, well, each part, you have to guarantee that any part of the pile has been above 131 degrees Fahrenheit for a minimum of 3 days. So that's to kill all the pathogens, basically. So, because they can't survive those temperatures. And the other nice thing is weed seeds can't survive it. So, now if you do a cold compost process, which is slower, which is probably what most of you are doing, you don't have a big pile that's steaming hot and you're not turning it all the time. You're just kind of piling stuff up. That's going to be a cold compost pile. It won't kill the weed seeds. So if you put weeds in there with seeds on them, they're going to germinate. And tomatoes are actually the worst, the worst thing. They'll grow all over your garden because you put them in your compost, bad tomatoes or whatever. So, but the heat process, and it also changes, like I said, it raises the pH, and those bacteria create a whole set of compounds that plants like, but you can't use it too soon after it's been through that hot process, or it actually will suppress plants. And maybe that's what happened in your case, is that it was too new.
Yeah.
Like ours has to be cooled down to the pile has to be down to a certain temperature.
So what is then the difference between your hot compost pile and the regular compost pile? Is it just bigger, or?
To get a hot compost pile,
Yeah.
to build a hot compost pile, you need enough nitrogen, which is supplied by things like grass clippings or manures, plant materials that are high in nitrogen, like pea vines are good, like they're green. And so grass clippings are probably your most accessible source. So things like leaves are very high in carbon. Wood shavings are really high. They're probably, we have a hard time getting there. The ideal ratio is about 25 to 40 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So 1 part of nitrogen and 25 to 40 parts of carbon. That's the kind of balance you want. So for every time you put some green stuff on, you should put on your pile, you should put a layer of, it's like making lasagna. That's the, it's the metaphor for it. You just make lasagna with these different layers of green material and brown material, green material and brown material. And once you break that pile, it'll start heating in the middle. There's enough, it also has to have air. It's an aerobic process. So you make too big a pile, it'll just be all stinky under there. And if you have a lot of green, like kitchen waste, there's a lot of green material, nitrogen material. So, I've made a couple compost piles just by not turning them and neglecting them. They get really stinky. Just because they don't get any air, it goes anaerobic. And so you really want to get some material in there that lets the pile breathe, so some coarse material and that kind of thing. So leaves are okay, but leaves tend to mat in the pile, and then they kind of form this slimy layer that air can't get through. So if you're going to use leaves, a lot of leaves, either put them in a separate pile for a year, because they sort of break down by a different process. They break down by a fungal process. And your cold compost pile a lot of the breakdown in there will be actually fungal instead of bacterial. It's fungal, it's fungi that can live in cooler temperatures and not the hot temperatures in the pile. So basically, when this hot compost is done, it's almost sterile except for those bacteria that can live in the hot pile. So that's why you can grow mushrooms on it, because there's nothing to compete with the mushrooms. But but a cold pile you'll have. Now, there are benefits to each one. The biggest benefit to the cold pile is that it's just easier. It's still good material for your garden. There's nothing wrong with it. It'll still turn this black. Like, I have some old piles of hay, and you pull that back, and there's this nice black, crumbly compost, and it's great for growing transplants and that. Like, that's almost all we use in our transplant mix now. So it's compost. But hay is another. If you can get old hay somewhere, if somebody's discarding some old hay bales and stuff, that's great for your compost. It's almost perfect for composting. Straw is not, it's all carbon. So is anybody using materials they have questions about, how they're working in their compost
Is there
pile?
one better manure than another? I know chicken manure is very rich.
Yeah, it's very high in nitrogen, and so you would want to mix it with a lot of brown stuff. It's not that they're better or no. Chicken manure is also very high in phosphorus, so I wouldn't want to use it exclusively, because you would build up your phosphorus too high in your soil, maybe. And like, our soils are actually, the farm hadn't been farmed for 10 years, and just hay had been cut and taken off, and we bought it, and the soil was still really high in phosphorus because they used to spread chicken manure on it. There was a chicken barn down the road, and they get all this chicken manure for free. So, but it's great stuff. It's a little bit, you don't want to put it on your garden raw either. So
it's about a year
on top, yeah. But
right?
it's a great thing for your compost, because it's the hardest thing to find especially for a hot compost pile, is that nitrogen material, and chicken manure is really high in nitrogen. Cow manure is pretty good too. Horse manure it's still pretty hot, and so it'll heat up pretty well. So different animals digest in different ways, and they use different materials too. So it almost depends a little bit too on what type of chickens, whether they're broilers or they're egg layers. But like, horses are terribly inefficient feeders, so almost everything they eat goes right through them. So it makes a nice compost. It's just kind of, it's all, it makes perfect compost really, like it's by itself. But the problem is the bedding is complicates things. And you can also grow a little bit of crops too for your compost too. Like we will sometimes put hay in our compost if we have extra old hay or something come out of the barn. But you might, I know there are people that grow, they might have a section in the back of their lot or something it's not really, it's out too far out of the way or something. So they'll just grow a crop that they can cut down and put in their compost pile. And nettles are supposed to be awesome, stinging nettles, but so if you find some stinging nettles, they make great compost. They're really high in nutrients. And they're not much fun to handle, but so the cold compost is fine for your soil. You just want to you have to be a little more conscious about what you put in there in terms of weed seeds and that kind of thing. The nice thing about a hot compost pile is that it generally kills all the weed seeds. So if I put this on to germinate, or I put, like right now, I put onions, I started my onions in this, I might see one weed per tray, and that's probably because it was on the ground and it was frozen when I tried to dig it up, and I got some soil underneath, and the weed seeds probably came from the soil. But our compost piles will grow, they'll stay there all summer with no weeds on them. But the plants that are around the compost piles will just, we have to actually trim the weeds so they don't make seeds and then pollen into the pile. So this year I'm gonna plant some squash around the outside and see what they do.
We have here compost piles at the garden that are about 4 by 4 feet and maybe 4 feet high. Is that considered a hot compost? Or
That would be good for, that's the sort of minimum size for a hot compost, I would say. Some people will say as small as 3 feet by 3 feet, but 4 by 4 is a lot better. It's, you're looking at 9 versus 16, so almost twice as much volume in that 4 by 4. So pallets make a great composter. They're almost 4 feet by 4 feet. One of the best composters is just made out of fence wire. The problem with the city composters is that I just call them rotters, really. Like they don't let enough air in, and they're really hard to turn too. So get the stuff out of them, like either take them, undo the screws, and they really don't keep squirrels out anyway. So squirrels just chew right through them. So one of the best things is a piece of fence wire with mesh, maybe 2 inches apart. You can do it with co-op. You can buy it by the foot, and then either just clip it together with some little, kind of like dog leash clips or something like that. Some way you can take it apart really easy, and just pile that full, and that'll make a nice cold compost pile.
so how often do you have to turn the compost?
Well, that's the problem with a pile like that, with a wire thing like that. You probably aren't going to turn it. It's just going to be cold. Now, if you want to turn it, you need some sort of structure where you can actually get in to turn it.
That's what we have here in this garden and on the other side.
So if you want to turn it and keep it hot, once a week for a while is a good schedule.
What means once a week?
Once a week you turn it and do that for about 3, 4, maybe 5 times. And so that'll make a hot compost, but you'll be done in 5 weeks. So I'm on a schedule.
Normally it's so there are 3 or 4 boxes. You start in box 1, you put it in box 2, then in box 3, and if there's a box 4, in box 4. So
yeah, and you end up then.
And you normally do it when one of the boxes is full and it has to be turned into the next.
Yeah, you need an empty box to start with the turn, unless you bring it all out on the ground and put it all back in again. But it can be a little labor intensive, and that's why just a freestanding pile is sometimes the best way for a hot pile. So, because you can get around it, and you can kind of, like our piles, it's a long windrow, and I just use the tractor to push one edge up over the pile, and that becomes the center of the pile eventually. And so I'm just kind of, the pile's moving sideways, but it's turning the whole time, and and that way I know the pile never really cools down either, because I'm not disturbing the center of the pile very much. And then, so about the second or third time, the second time, I'm putting previously heated compost, so it's already been hot, and that becomes a cover on the other side. And so you have to, there's different strategies for doing that, but sometimes you can make a hot, but I have to do it to a certain method, and I have to guarantee it meets this temperature for a few days. If you're doing it at home, you make a big pile, and sometimes people put a pipe in the middle, and just put everything around that. That's a good way to make sure there's some airflow, makes a little chimney, and start it with some rough material, branches, that kind of thing. So it becomes, the biggest danger is that you use fine material like grass clippings and kitchen waste and stuff, and it just becomes this big, kind of sticky.
Throw orange, lemon, and grapefruit peel on it, but they normally rot. They do not compost, and they should not go into compost.
They won't rot?
They most of the time rot.
Oh, yeah.
So I heard that they should not go into a compost pile.
Yeah, I don't know. Citrus, I know worms don't like. If you have a worm bin, like if you feed your kitchen waste to it, some people have worm bins with worms underneath their counter or something, underneath their sink, and they won't eat citrus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should go in the garden.
No, I put them in my compost, but somewhere just in that cold compost pile that's going to be there for a long time. So really, you should be composting this year for 2 years down the road. So you want that stuff material really broken down, and so that's the trick, is to get that far ahead, so you're not trying to use compost that's too new or too coarse. This compost here, it's quite dry, but this is very fine.
if it wasn't dry, it'd be quite crumbly, like the soil. It was in my greenhouse all summer, since last summer, so it's quite dry. It's very fine material, and that's, you can see that's it's a very soft. Oops, I didn't do this. Yeah, it's very soft material, very fine, and
That would be perfect for your vegetables, most of your vegetables. You know, it's really black gold in the garden. Like, it's really the best thing you can do for your garden. Now, there are some other things that we use. Now, these can be added directly to your soil or to your garden if you have, if you think you're having some fertility issues. This is green sand. Green sand. It's called Jersey green sand.
Where do you get it?
It's a little tough to find. Scots might carry it. They used to have little bags of it. Really expensive though, but I bring it in by the ton, so sometimes I have some extra. And it's basically, it's an old silicate. It's a deposit, ocean deposit, an old ocean deposit. So it has a high level of potassium, and it also has all of the micronutrients that are found in the ocean, basically. So if you have minor, I like it because if you have minor deficiencies, they'll never show up in a soil test. But those nutrients are there, so I like it because the soil,
Spots have it in a bag with that big, and then small ones.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a whole lot. We use it mostly. We don't really put it much on the gardens because we have lots of compost, and it's fairly high in potassium. But I used to use it in my garden. We use this mostly in our transplant mix.
So which other fertilizer would you recommend when the plants are not doing very well? When the plants here in our area
this
are
is
not
this.
doing well enough,
The only two I would really recommend are green sand or kelp meal. Kelp meal is a good one that's got the same. Actually, kelp meal, some people think is better than green sand. So you can find this. Again, it's a little tough to find. This is rock phosphate. This is from an old phosphorus deposit. It either comes from Florida or there's one deposit in Canada.
that's good too. That's good too for the garden.
If you're low in phosphorus in your garden, yeah. So it's hard to tell except by some plants if you know what to look for in your plants. But it's good to add. This is the nice thing about these. They're mineral, so there's not very much available at any given time. So this is, I think it's 22% phosphorus, but it's only a small amount of it is available, and it's basically a clay, kind of in clumps here now, but it's available very slowly. So I wouldn't put these on more than once every 4 years, because if you put it on now, it's going to be there for 4 years. So some of it will be available this year, some of it will be available next year, some will be available. So those are good things to add if you're going to add any. Like for myself, I would never add any chemical fertilizers. They're a quick fix, but.
What about alfalfa pellets?
Sorry, what?
Alfalfa pellets.
Alfalfa is good for nitrogen, yeah. There's a wee bit of potassium too, I think, but alfalfa meal, I wouldn't go with pellets, I would just use alfalfa meal. And it's available in like 50-pound bags. It's fairly expensive though, I can't remember. We do use it in our transplant mix, we use alfalfa meal, but it's too expensive to use in the field. So if we do have to use nitrogen in the field, to add something, we use crab meal. Crab meal, if you can find crab meal, or fish meal, if you can stand the smell, it's really quite strong. But those will add a little nitrogen, and we do use a few tons of crab meal if we can get it. Just on the really heavy feeders like corn and potatoes and.
Do you also use biodynamic farming?
No, we don't. I don't know that much about biodynamic. I have one friend who, it sometimes becomes dogmatic, people making these mixtures up and this and that, and burying cow horns and things. And But I have a friend who described it very much as the farmer's relationship between the land and himself. So I have a little more time for that, but I don't really know too much about the biodynamics.
It's more like a homeopathic treatment for the soil.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a science to it, so,
But I think if
and
you're,
it's not well known.
yeah, if it, you know, it may have more benefits in soils that are not doing very well, and I don't really know enough to speak about biodynamics. I know there are a few people that swear by it, a lot of people actually, and
What it does actually, I read an article about it. The difference between a plant grown organically and biodynamically is that you have much more microorganisms in the soil, and the plant will have much bigger root system, and because it has a bigger root system, you get more nutrients in your vegetable. So with other words, the biodynamically grown vegetable is better than the organic grown one. So it's quite
biodynamic.
interesting to look into this.
Yeah, just for everybody else, biodynamic farming it originated in the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, who you probably have heard of, because he was writings about education, but he also wrote about farming, and it's very much about sort of harnessing the energy in nature and sort of like focusing the energy into the plants and the soil and that kind of thing. So, I don't know much about it, but I do know there's a lot we don't know about that kind of thing. So I don't say there's nothing to it. A lot of people would be very quick to write.
I understand it like a homeopathic treatment for the soil, because you need just very small amounts diluted in water, and you have a very substantial effect on the soil. I actually have a video about farmers that there was land in New Zealand, and it was completely destroyed with conventional farming methods. It had dried out and cracked, and the owners just left it. And then a biodynamic farmer came in with his methods, and he got the soil.
I've seen, I don't know how many of you have heard the term permaculture. Permaculture is sort of, it's a sort of a system of ideas, I guess. It's not dogmatic at all. It's sort of using a set of principles to work with nature to grow food and healthy communities too, I guess. But you use the same principles there to grow things in India where the soil was completely destroyed, and also in places like Jordan, right down by the Dead Sea. They use a lot of mulches, and they made swales to sort of contain the water, so the water was accessible. It was captured by the mulches, and they were growing things there that the locals couldn't even believe they were growing, and the locals had never seen a mushroom before, and all of a sudden mushrooms were popping out of the compost. But it's really about taking care of the soil. Like, there's only a thin layer of soil on the earth. Like, if you took a globe and you spray painted it, that layer of paint would be many times thicker than the layer of soil around the earth. That's how thin it is. It's only a few inches of soil around the earth, and a lot of the earth is desert, or a lot of the land actually is desert or too frozen to really make soil. So it's quite a precious resource, that the soil, and we lose a lot of it to erosion. There's a little garden I started over at Renaissance College. It's about 1,000 square feet, and that's generally regarded as enough to supply vegetables to one person for a year. And I did a calculation based on soil loss, and mostly in conventional agriculture, and we were losing the ability to feed people. We're losing 65 million of those gardens a day. So, in soil loss around the world. Yeah, if I remember that correctly, the calculation worked out to that. So we were losing the ability to feed people. At the same time as the population is increasing around the world, we're also losing topsoil and the ability to feed people. So it's going to make it's gonna make something of a crisis in the future probably, but, so it's really a precious resource, but you can, I've started with some pretty bad soils and made something out of them. Like that greenhouse soil was not a great spot, right? It was a nice flat spot to put the greenhouse, but it was in front of the barn, and the previous owners had driven a lot of equipment in there, and it wasn't real high in organic matter, and so it was kind of compact, like really hard digging.
So then where did you get your organic matter? Do you have animals on the farm?
Not too much. No, most of it comes from the. Right now, we bought some compost in the beginning.
From another farm?
Yeah, there are compost companies too. There's one in Sussex. There's one in town, but we weren't very happy with their product. And so you can buy different composts, but we grew cover crops and things. That field before we put the greenhouse the year before, I grew a cover crop of oats and peas, I think. And so, and sometimes it's just tillage helps a little bit, like the double digging. I don't know if I would bother double digging most of the time, but it's only if you have a real drainage issue, like if you have heavy clay and it goes down a long ways. What happens is when it rains, the water level just keeps coming up and it'll drown your plants right out. So that's where the double digging really, if you had a sandy soil, I wouldn't bother double digging. In fact, you're doing probably more harm than good, because you're bringing any organic matter down there up and it's oxidizing and that kind of thing. So it really depends on your soil type. But with a heavy clay soil like this, it probably was especially there's nowhere for the water to go, I don't think, underneath there. Just knowing a little bit about the soil around here, if you dig a hole, it fills up with water almost. So our farm is a little bit the same, but we have a little better drainage. So yeah.
You mentioned too about the little soil testing kits. I don't know if you're familiar. You can buy little ones for $12, and you can test all of those little windows that you were talking about, the little tubes, and they give you colors. They're simple to use, and so you can really identify what you're missing in your soil.
Yeah, and if you had, like, if you 2 or 3 people got together, it would only cost a few dollars probably.
Yeah, it's a little kit. Several. You can test, there are a little series of, there's maybe 7 little jars in them. So there's little drops. It's like when you test a pool, like a swimming pool. And so you put these little drops in and then they turn a color, and then you have a little tape and you see whether it's more yellow or
this kit is good for more than one soil.
Yes, you can use it a few times. And people from the garden can go together if you wanted to test your soil.
Yeah, you have to be really, you have to be careful when you're using them, because it's like, you're doing chemistry, like a lab chemistry at home basically. So, but they are helpful. They can be helpful, especially with pH. They're really cheap for a pH test. So basically, it's just a litmus paper and solution. You put it in the solution you make with the soil. I have used them in the past. Now we mostly just use the soil. We actually get a reduced rate for soil tests, so we use it, and it's kind of it's more important, I guess, for us because it's a commercial operation. So it's just part of our cost. We expect to do 5 or 6 samples a year, generally, different fields and that kind of thing. So we don't test every field every year. I don't really see, the advantage in that because I know that there is a reservoir of nutrients in my soil and I know what my compost is, and so I do have the compost tested, and a good way to test a compost is to plant some seedlings in it and see how they grow. If you're going to be using it for a transplant mix. So what I'll do with this, every compost pile, is I take a tray of it and I put pea seeds in it. And if the peas come up and they stay nice and green and they just keep on growing, eventually I eat them, usually pea shoots. But if they stay nice and green and healthy, then you've got a pretty good soil to start with there. So if they start turning yellow, then you're really low in nitrogen, or there's some other deficiency, but it's usually nitrogen. Now peas after a while will start making their own nitrogen, but there's little bacteria that attach to the roots on peas, beans, and other legumes, clover, and that kind of thing. And they actually take nitrogen from the air and supply it to the plant. That's why they're good cover crops, because they'll add nitrogen into the soil. Nitrogen is often the limiting factor in your garden. So you can supply some of it through good compost, by feeding your compost really good. And the worms will kind of, there'll be worms in a cold compost pile, there'll be lots of worms in the bottom of that. So, and their feces will have nitrogen.
I read somewhere, some method, you have all these kitchen scraps, but they're not composted, they're just kitchen scraps, right? Just dig a trench, if you were to plant something and dig a trench, throw the kitchen scraps in the bottom of the trench, cover it up with dirt, and then plant on top.
Sure, it wouldn't hurt anything, yeah.
Right.
That'll create all kinds of activity in the soil, and the farmers used to put, back when fish were plentiful, like gas burrow would come up the river here, and they would put a gas burrow under every potato, basically. And great nitrogen, actually. You have nice green potato,
And you're talking about some of this stuff. Like my grandfather, I've seen him taste the soil. He always planted oats and peas. I didn't know why,
yeah.
but he did. My husband's grandfather lived on the Miramichi, and he talks about his grandfather doing that, bringing wagon loads of gas burrow up, and they put them in their garden.
Yeah.
He said they, just like that lady said, they dug a trench, covered it over, and then planted the crops. But they brought the gas burrow up from the Miramichi.
Yeah, yeah. The gas burrow, they come in from the ocean, and so they're bringing nutrients, a way of bringing nutrients back. We're always losing nutrients into the ocean, but so they knew enough. Like those are really scarce resources, particularly before chemical fertilizers. Nitrogen was tough to come by. The only source we had was manure.
What would you recommend regarding compost? To dig the compost from the compost pile into the plot in the fall, or just put it on top, or put the compost on top after planting in the spring?
No, I would put it in and work it in lightly and then plant. That's usually what I try to do.
Fall.
Yeah. No, in the spring too.
In the spring.
Yeah. If you're going to put it on the fall, just leave it on top. The worms will take care of the rest. And you're going to work it in the spring anyway. So you're going to get rid of any weeds or old residue in the spring. So in the spring, what I try and do is I'll chisel plow the field, or I'll spread this and then I'll chisel plow. And chisel plow is just big fingers that go through the soil and they kind of loosen it up. And we're not turning it over. Like that's the biggest enemy in soil in the last 300 years has been the moldboard plow. It flips the soil over and it turns the whole soil profile upside down. The organisms are all confused, and it oxidizes organic matter. And so that's why we're having organic matter in the soil, like in the prairies, it's gone down from 6 or 8% down to 1 or 2%, generally down around 1% or something like that. So because of the use of moldboard plow. So what we try and do is not disturb you. You want to loosen your garden up. That's the best thing you can do for with a fork or a broad fork.
But don't turn it.
Don't turn it
Yeah,
over.
don't turn it over really. Yeah, no. Sometimes when you're starting out, I use my moldboard plow about once every 2 years when I'm in particular conditions, and that's only just to start, if there's a lot of roots and stuff in there, and then I'll usually grow a cover crop for a year to sort of let things settle down again, and I think probably I won't use it anymore at all actually. But so I try not to turn things over because you're disturbing the strata of there's different organisms at the top, there's different organisms in the middle, and there's different ones at the bottom, and the fungal end of they call it the food web, basically, the soil food web. The fungi live the best in the top area. And now they do go down there, but there's bacteria, and then finally, worms are the most adventurous. They'll go 5 or 6 feet down. So, but in that, and so with this compost, and probably any compost you're going to make at home is going to be quite a bit of organic matter, in carbon. You want that in that top layer where the air can get at it and the fungus can really act on it, because they don't steal all your nitrogen. And so what I'll do is, with this, we'll spread it on, we'll just work it in very loosely, and then we'll plant. And we try not to turn things upside down too much. I mean, that's kind of the traditional way of doing it, is to plow your garden every year, and that's the way I grew up, you know, and there's nothing more satisfying than plowing a field. Like, it looks so nice and neat, and so much, you know, it's kind of a traditional skill, and it was, you know, it was really appreciated when that was like, you know, they're plowing contests, you know, in the culture where I grew up, you know, farming cultures. And so, you know, if you were good at plowing fields, that was really something. But now we're trying to get away from it. I think, like, now, you know, minimum tillage, and so but I think you can use those things in your garden too, really. Like, in fact, one of the gurus of organic gardening, small scale market farming, is Elliot Coleman, and he uses a broad fork for most of his. And I haven't visited his farm, but I had some interns that worked at my farm, and they went there, and, you know, they said the soil was, you know, 16 inches of nice, friable soil, but they never